Hello and welcome back to my office. I've had an interesting couple of questions this month, so I'd like to say thanks to Omar Alexander. He said that he wanted to know, first of all, what was the most challenging or difficult book I wrote and why was it so? Was it the research or was it something in the personal life that made writing difficult or something else? How do you handle the challenges? Well, it's actually quite difficult to think of one particular book that has been particularly hard, other than obviously The Last Templar, because that was the very first book I wrote and I was learning how I could write and whether what I wrote was going to be even remotely interesting. I do remember having to restart that 3 or 4 times, but then that's not abnormal. I think almost every book I've written I've had to restart it. I should apologise, I'm getting over a bad cold, so that's why the voice sounds a bit lower than normal and gruff. But I would think that the most difficult books, all of them, have been the first books in a new series, apart from 2 of them. The 2 that were never any problem at all were Act of Vengeance and Rebellion's Message, the first of the Tudor series. Act of Vengeance was really quite straightforward to write because that involved... I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the bookshelf. I've got all my books in front of me there so I can look up and remind myself about them. Act of Vengeance was written very much based on a series of signing tours I did in America. So I went to New York, I went to Vegas, to Seattle, San Francisco, I went to Chicago, all over the Midwest, across from Austin to Houston in Texas. I've covered quite a lot of territory in America, and so writing about someone running away in those areas and an investigation that covered multiple states was really very straightforward. And of course the nice thing is that writing about the present day involves very little research indeed. If you're talking about guns, I've got a lot of information about guns here. If I'm talking about other things, I can pick them up from a newspaper. So writing about the present day is an awful lot easier. When you see people in the bestseller lists and they say, oh yes, I've done a lot of research writing about the present day, they haven't. They don't know what research is. I would say Rebellion's Message was also very easy. It was a different period, so it should have been more difficult, but in reality it was very straightforward. The main reason being that I was writing from my perspective, so I didn't have to do a lot of research into how various politicians were thinking about things at the time. I was working from the point of view of someone at the bottom of the pile, looking up and really just dealing with the stuff that kept landing on his head from above. He wasn't someone who was worried about the politics of the country as such. He was much more concerned about where his next meal was coming from. And it was written in a light-hearted manner. So I'm sure there are probably historical inaccuracies in there, but actually I'm not bothered. It's supposed to be a light-hearted frolic, a romp. I call them frolics, I think that's a suitable way of describing them. And I like them. The Bloody Mary series have been really good fun. They work like a small holiday for me, until I get to the stage I'm at now with the current one, which should have been finished last week, and I've got another 15,000 words to write because I'm rewriting the end. Not happy with it. It doesn't quite grab me enough, so it's not going to grab you. So those are the easy ones. The difficult ones were The Last Templar, Fields of Glory and Pilgrim's War. Each of those 3, the beginning of a group. Last Templar, obviously the Templar series. Fields of Glory was the first of the trilogy about the 100 Years' War, and Pilgrim's War was the first in a projected series about the Crusades. The Templar series you know about, so I won't talk about that. The book was difficult to write, but that's because it was a first book. No other reason made it difficult. I learned an awful lot about writing from that, and it was a joy when The Merchant's Partner was sent off to the publisher, and there were really no corrections or suggestions to be made with that. They felt that was a perfectly good story in its own right as soon as it arrived. So that was reassuring. I'd learned a lot from The Last Templar. However, Vintner Trilogy was much harder, and that's because the publishers, Simon & Schuster, had decided they didn't want to continue with the Templar series, although that was the reason why I went to Simon & Schuster, was to continue with the Templar series, because they said they wanted a medieval crime series. But my editors changed 4 or 5 times, and the latest one had come from HarperCollins, and she was much more keen on war books, Viking stories and the like. And so she said she wanted to have more of a war type series. Could I write something totally different? And that, after 32 crime books, all based on Simon Puttock and Baldwin Fernhill, that was a challenge and difficult. I had to reinvent a series of characters. That wasn't so easy because I was talking about a slightly different period. Only slightly, but a lot of things changed in the 30 years or so. And trying to invent people who are going to be warlike professional killers in effect, which is what a lot of the soldiers were in the 100 Years' War, that is a totally different mindset to the life of someone living on Dartmoor, a knight or a peasant or whatever it might be. Totally different. And the fears and the concerns that they have when going on a long march all the way down to Paris, and then either being chased away or deliberately trying to tease the French army away from its home base so that the king could fight on land of his own choosing. Whichever approach you believe may be true, I had to leave that open to you to perceive from reading the book, because it is argued still by a lot of people that Edward III knew exactly what he was doing with the Crécy campaign. He wanted to have a battle at Crécy because he had been there before, he had seen it, we know that. But other people say, no, he had no idea about that. He was on a grand rampage through France, trying to steal what he could, trying to upset the French king, and then when the French army suddenly materialised, he went, oh no, I can't deal with this, and bolted, ran back to the Somme, and then up to Crécy, and it was just sheer fluke that the British managed to beat the French. It's fair to say that I tried to encapsulate all of that by looking at things from the point of view of the soldier. I don't make it clear whether or not the king actually thought that he had a great master plan or anything. That's way out of the league of my archers. They didn't know really what was going on. They were just the grunts. They were the soldiers at the bottom of the pile doing what they were told. But I did try to give the impression that they weren't over the moon all the time about how the battle was going, and that about how the campaign was going, rather. And so that took a lot of extra research. It took a lot of thinking about the motivations of the people. It was a hard book to write, but really quite enjoyable. The next two, because the characters of Beringer, Fripper and the others were well defined in my head, they were a lot easier because I knew how they were going to react to things. Pilgrim's War was difficult again, because by the time Pilgrim's War came out, it was clear to me that I wasn't getting any marketing support from Simon & Schuster. In fact, I'd had a meeting with them because when Fields of Glory came out, they had sent out one tweet to market that book. They didn't put it on Facebook that the book was being launched. They did nothing apart from one Twitter message. So I was extremely angry about that, and so was my agent, and we had a meeting with my new editor and her assistant editor and the new head of marketing and the new head of publicity, and I was given strong assurances that no matter what, they would have sensible marketing for the future books. So I thought, great. By the time Pilgrim's War came about, I knew that that wasn't the case. There had been no marketing for the previous two books. Absolutely nothing whatsoever. So I was writing that book feeling that I was probably not going to be staying with Simon & Schuster because I couldn't trust them. It was the last book I had in a contract, so I had to write a book. I had to cope with all of the problems of inventing a whole new series of characters. I had the idea that this was going to be the launch not of a book that was the long march to Jerusalem. This was going to be the beginning of almost a saga with two halves of a family that were at complete loggerheads. One that would be a military part of the family, so there would be a knightly wing, and the other wing would be a mercantile venture. And what I wanted to do was look at the history of the Crusader kingdoms as I've treated other books, looking at it from the point of view of ordinary people who went out there. What sorts of experiences would they have had? How would they have dealt with the various disasters that affected Christianity while they were there? So the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, for example, how would that have affected people back in the town of Acre or in Jerusalem? How would they feel about that sort of thing happening? So there was an awful lot of research to do around that because I was setting up a very lengthy series. The sad thing, of course, was that I had to say to Simon & Schuster earlier this year that because they did no marketing whatsoever for Pilgrim's War, basically they cost me 18 months worth of income because the book was supposed to come out, but they delayed it and delayed it and delayed it. Not because of edits, but because they decided not to publish, basically. They had other books they wanted to bring forward. So they delayed it and delayed it. Eventually I demanded that it come out. They published it. No marketing. Again, there was one tweet when I did a signing at a bookshop in London. There was no tweet to announce publication, nothing on Facebook to announce publication. So my worst fears did come true, unfortunately. And then, when the book did come out, I was promised that there would be a paperback version within a year. After 18 months, again through my agent, I demanded to know when the paperback was going to come out, and they had decided they weren't going to bother with a paperback, and instead, basically I said to them that since they weren't interested, it was clearly a book that they weren't interested in trying to sell, therefore I wanted to have the rights back, and they've let me take the rights back for all the books. But so that was more difficult because of the complete lack of any sort of support from the publisher for the book, as well as me being actually aware at the back of my mind that it was likely that it wasn't going to get any support as well. So trying to develop a theme for a series that should be 5 or 6 books long, when you know the publisher has lost interest before they've even seen the original draft, it makes that a very, very difficult book to write. Things can get in the way of writing. One of my books I had to dedicate to my daughter and thanked her, because without all of her help and interruptions the book would have been written in half the time, paraphrasing P.G. Wodehouse. So life gets in the way of books. Life can be difficult. This book I'm working on currently, I have said that I'm a bit behind with it. That's partly because we've had some illness in my family. I've had my problem with my ears, and I'm going to have to go and have an MRI scan, which, don't panic, it's not a problem. For people in America, excuse me, yes, we have the NHS. I'm going for an MRI scan because there's always a risk when you have sudden hearing loss that it could be due to a tumour, but the likelihood is it's not. I had the same hearing loss with this ear. It's much more likely to be a viral infection that's caused the damage to the nerve endings. So don't worry on that score. And this is not a plea for money. The National Health Service pays for all of that sort of thing over here. So another member of my close family, very close family, has suddenly suddenly developed epilepsy, which is a major problem. Or cause of concern, I should say. It's not a problem as such. Hopefully it will be something that can be controlled with drug use. But it is a concern. Someone who's very young, and it's not something that you want to see. So that is a concern. he's got to go in for more tests with an EEG, whatever it is, to see if they can find out what's causing the epilepsy. That is a problem. Again, it's not a problem financially because the NHS will pay for it all, but it's something that's in the back of your mind. And when you're trying to write a book, especially say a light-hearted, frivolous book like one of my Bloody Mary series, then obviously if you've got something dramatic going on in real life, that does have a knock-on effect with your writing. It's far less easy to be frivolous and entertaining when you've got concerns in the back of your mind all the time. But they are the sort of things that all authors have to cope with. I've got a very good friend who last week lost her husband. That's obviously going to have an impact on her ability to write, because when you lose a close member of your family, that always has an impact. When I was writing, let's see, I think it must have been Blood on the Sand, my mother died. That had very obviously a negative impact on my ability to write quite so many words every day as I was used to. When I was writing Pilgrim's War, my father died. When I was writing Blood of the Innocents, my best friend died. These things all have an impact, as do losing dogs, when our dogs die. And we've lost several dogs in the last few years. When they die, that has a huge impact on me, because my dogs are my general companion. It's a very odd thing being a writer, because of course you're sitting alone at a desk in a moderately chilly house, because I'm tight-fisted and I won't burn that much oil to keep the place hot through the day. We turn the central heating off through the day and it only comes on at night when the family's at home. So most of my life is spent with two work colleagues, and they're the two dogs. So when one of the dogs dies, that is the same as for the average person losing a close work colleague, the one person that they spend time talking to over the water cooler or the coffee machine, the person they sit next to most often during lunch times, during work times. The dogs, for me, are my work companions very much. So when one of the dogs dies, that's a huge impact on me, and it has a dramatic impact on my working life. So there's lots of things that make writing difficult. Oddly enough, one of the worst things I ever did was trying to experiment writing a book longhand with a fountain pen. And it hadn't occurred to me how difficult that was likely to be, because I love fountain pens and I love paper, and as you can see on my YouTube videos, I really adore using pens on paper. But the difficulty is, it does take a great deal longer than just typing away on a keyboard. And it hadn't occurred to me just how much of an impact that would be likely to have on my writing. But it did have a dramatic impact. It slowed me down a huge amount. And that probably cost me a book or so in a year. So, in answer to your question, Omar, there are many things that can have an impact. Those are a few of them. Certainly, starting a new series, I find, always has a big impact. I would imagine most authors who start writing standalone books must have the same sort of feeling. It is difficult when you're inventing a new world, because that's what you're doing with every new book, every new series. You're inventing a world, and you're inventing new people. You're really getting a god complex, aren't you? Because you're inventing absolutely everything about it, as well as a story and a plot. So anything that distracts, anything that gets in the way, is going to cause problems. And it does have a direct impact on your writing, it's bound to. The only thing I would say is that having written 43, 44 books now, it doesn't have as much of an impact as it would do with new writers, I guess, because I at least have the experience now to know that if I've got a real problem with writing, I keep on writing anyway. And I might write 2,000 words of absolute crap that I've got to throw away at the end of the day. But it doesn't matter, I've got 2,000 words, I can use them. I think it's a lot more difficult for someone who's new to writing, who thinks, oh, well, I'll put it down for now, I'll get back to it tomorrow, and then toddle off and watch the latest soap opera or film or whatever or play games on the Xbox, whatever it might be. When I started writing, it was much more straightforward. We were so broke we couldn't afford a television license, so we got rid of the television. So there were no interruptions. We didn't have mobile phones in those days, we didn't have anything much really. So back in the early 1990s, I decided to write. I had no distractions. I started writing, that was it. And over the years, I know how I can frame my day. Write for 1,000 words, that's 1 hour roughly. Take a 10-minute break to make a coffee and think about the next scene, then write 1,000 words, that's another scene done. And in that way, I can easily write 5,000 to 7,000 words in a day without any problems at all. I tend to stick to about 5,000 a day, purely because that means I've got plenty of time to edit the work that I was doing the day before as well, so I can edit the previous day's work, and that builds me up. It's like one of those ski jump aircraft carrier lift-off things that they have, where the aircraft comes along, hits the ski jump, and that gives it an immediate trajectory upwards. That's what I feel it's like when you're editing the previous day's work and working through it and building up. And I play the same music as I played the previous day, and that way my brain gets into that frame of mind for that scene and builds me up to it, so that then when I get onto the new scene, the new bit of writing, which is normally early afternoon, I can crack straight on with it without any problem. So, various things get in the way. Yes, Omar. I hope that was interesting. I hope it was worthwhile. I'm going to be producing another video, a special video just for Patreon, which is going to be about my office. Because I've had a number of people say, well, we'd really like to see what's in your office. So, look forward to that, and there'll be a Christmas message included, just to say thanks to you all, in effect. And I hope you'll look forward to that. Hope this was useful and interesting, and give me any other questions you've got, and I'll look forward to answering them in due course. Thanks very much for watching, and take care. Bye.